In the vast expanse of the Mongolian steppes, where endless grasslands stretch toward horizons that seem to touch the very edge of eternity, the wind carries whispers of ancient times. Here, beneath skies so immense they dwarf the human spirit, nomadic tribes once moved like shadows across the earth, following the rhythms of seasons and the migrations of their herds. The land itself breathes with the memory of hoofbeats, of felt tents rising and falling with the passage of countless generations, of fires that flickered against the darkness while storytellers wove tales of heroes and spirits into the fabric of night. It was in this timeless realm where shamans spoke to the eternal blue sky and warriors measured their worth in horses and courage, that a child was born who would reshape the very foundations of the world. The year was somewhere around 1162, though the precise date remains lost to the mists of history, as fluid and uncertain as the nomadic life itself. The Mongol tribes kept no written records then, measuring time not in years but in the turning of seasons, the births of foals, and the victories of their khans. The infant came into existence during a time of perpetual conflict, when the scattered tribes of the steppes warred endlessly among themselves, bound by ancient feuds and the harsh necessities of survival. His birth was marked, according to legend, by omens that would echo through the centuries. The child was said to have emerged from his mother's womb clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist, a sign that the shamans interpreted as a portent of great conquest to come. Whether this detail springs from later myth-making or represents some kernel of truth matters little, for it captures something essential about the figure who would become known to history as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, the conqueror of nations. The child was given the name Temujin after a Tatar warrior whom his father had recently defeated in battle. This practice of naming children after vanquished enemies was common among the Mongols, a way of claiming the strength and courage of the fallen for their own bloodline. Temujin's father was Yesugei, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, one of many small tribal groups that roamed the steppes in an endless dance of alliance and enmity. Yesugei was neither the most powerful nor the most wealthy of the steppe leaders, but he possessed that particular combination of cunning and charisma that allowed him to maintain his position in the brutal politics of nomadic life. The world into which Temujin was born was one of extraordinary harshness and beauty, where survival depended on an intimate knowledge of the natural world and an ability to adapt to its rhythms. The Mongol tribes were pastoral nomads, moving their herds of horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and camels across vast distances in search of fresh pasture. Their wealth was measured in livestock, their mobility was their greatest asset, and their skill as horsemen was legendary even among the accomplished riders of the steppes. Life followed the ancient patterns established by countless generations. In spring, the tribes would move to summer pastures, following routes that had been used for centuries. The men would hunt and raid, hone their skills as warriors, and tend to the horses that were the foundation of their existence. The women would manage the households, care for the herds, and preserve the oral traditions that bound the tribes together. Children learned to ride before they could properly walk, to shoot arrows with deadly accuracy, and to endure the extremes of weather that characterized the steppe environment. Yet this was also a world of constant danger and uncertainty. The tribes raided each other regularly, stealing horses and livestock, capturing women and children, and settling old scores in blood. Alliances formed and dissolved with the changing seasons, and trust was a luxury that few could afford. The strong preyed upon the weak, and survival often depended on one's ability to project strength even when vulnerable. Temujin's early years were shaped by both privilege and precariousness. As the son of a chieftain, he enjoyed certain advantages, but the position also made him a target. When he was still a young boy, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, his father arranged his betrothal to a girl named Berta from the Ongirat tribe, a common practice designed to strengthen alliances between groups. Yasuge left his son with Berta's family for a period, as was customary, but on his journey home, he encountered a group of Tatars who recognized him as an old enemy. The Tatars, whose name would later become synonymous with the Mongol Empire in the minds of their terrified victims, invited Yasuge to share a meal with them, a gesture that appeared to honor the ancient laws of hospitality that governed steppe society. But the invitation was a trap, and they poisoned him during the feast. Yasuge managed to make his way home, but the poison had done its work, and he died a slow and agonizing death, leaving behind a family suddenly vulnerable to the harsh realities of steppe politics. The death of Yasuge marked the beginning of what would prove to be the most formative period of Temujin's life. Without their leader, the Borjigin clan quickly fragmented. Many of Yasuge's followers abandoned his family, taking their herds and their loyalty to more powerful leaders who could offer them better protection and opportunities for advancement. Temujin, still just a boy, found himself thrust into the role of clan leader, but he lacked the age, experience, and resources to command respect. His family, consisting of his mother Hölün, his younger brothers Kasar, Kachiyun, and Temuge, his half-brother Begta, and his sister Temulun, was left to fend for themselves in a world that showed little mercy to the weak. They were forced to abandon their traditional nomadic lifestyle and take refuge in the wilderness, living off the land like outcasts, gathering roots and berries, hunting small game, and fishing in the rivers that wound through the steppes. These years of hardship and humiliation would leave an indelible mark on Temujin's character. He learned firsthand the brutal realities of power and survival, the price of weakness, and the importance of loyalty. The experience also taught him to think beyond the traditional boundaries of tribal identity, for he came to understand that the system of endless feuding and fragmentation that characterized steppe society was ultimately self-destructive. The first major crisis of Temujin's emerging leadership came from within his own family. His half-brother, Begta, older and stronger, began to assert dominance over the others, claiming the best portions of their meager food and challenging Temujin's authority. The situation came to a head when Begta seized a fish and a bird that Temujin had caught, an act that represented not just theft, but a direct challenge to Temujin's position as head of the family. Temujin and his full brother Kasar stalked Begta across the steppes and killed him with arrows, an act that would haunt Temujin for the rest of his life, but which also established his willingness to use violence to maintain his authority. When their mother discovered what had happened, she was horrified, not only by the fratricide itself, but by its implications for the family's survival. She understood that Temujin had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, that he had chosen the path of the warrior leader over the bonds of kinship. The murder of Begta soon brought its own consequences. The Taichud, a tribe that had been allied with Yasuge, captured Temujin and held him prisoner, forcing him to wear a wooden collar called a kangwe that prevented him from lying down or sleeping comfortably. He was displayed at tribal gatherings as a warning to others who might challenge the established order, a young man who had violated the most sacred taboos of steppe society. But Temujin's captivity also revealed the qualities that would eventually make him a great leader. He was patient, calculating, and opportunistic. During a festival when his captors were distracted by celebrations, he managed to escape, hiding in a river and eventually finding refuge with a family that chose to help him despite the risks. This experience taught him valuable lessons about human nature, about the importance of cultivating allies even among one's enemies, and about the power of mercy and gratitude to bind people to one's cause. As Temujin reached adulthood, he began the slow process of rebuilding his power and influence. He married Berta, fulfilling the betrothal arrangement his father had made years earlier, and the union brought him not only personal happiness, but also important political connections. Berta was intelligent, strong-willed, and politically astute, and she would prove to be one of his most important advisors throughout his rise to power. The marriage also brought Temujin his first real test as a leader. Berta was kidnapped by the Merkits, a powerful tribe that had long-standing grievances against Yesugei's family. The abduction was both a personal tragedy and a political crisis, for it called into question Temujin's ability to protect his own family, let alone lead others. The rescue of Berta would require military action on a scale that Temujin had never before attempted, and it would force him to seek alliances with other leaders who had their own agendas and ambitions. Temujin turned to two figures who would play crucial roles in his rise to power. The first was Togrul Khan, also known as Ong Khan, the leader of the Kerate tribe and an old ally of Yesugei. Togrul was a powerful and experienced leader, but he was also aging and facing challenges from within his own tribe. He agreed to help Temujin, seeing in the young man a potential ally who might be useful in his own struggles. The second was Jamuka, Temujin's blood brother and childhood friend, who had become a leader in his own right. Jamuka was brilliant, charismatic, and ambitious, qualities that made him both a valuable ally and a potential rival. The relationship between Temujin and Jamuka would prove to be one of the most complex and tragic in Mongol history, a friendship that would eventually be destroyed by the incompatible ambitions of two men who might have been the greatest leaders of their generation. Together, Temujin, Togrul, and Jamuka assembled a force large enough to challenge the Merkits. The campaign that followed was Temujin's first major military operation, and it demonstrated both his tactical acumen and his ability to inspire loyalty in his followers. The Allied forces struck the Merkits at dawn, catching them unprepared and scattered. In the chaos of the battle, Temujin managed to locate and rescue Berta, though she was already pregnant with a child whose paternity would remain forever uncertain. The successful rescue of Berta marked the beginning of Temujin's reputation as a military leader, but it also revealed the challenges he would face in building a lasting power base. The alliance with Togrul and Jamuka was inherently unstable, held together only by temporary common interests. Once the immediate threat was resolved, the underlying tensions between the three leaders began to surface. Jamuka, in particular, represented a fundamental alternative to Temujin's vision of leadership, where Temujin sought to build loyalty through personal relationships and shared hardship. Jamuka relied on traditional aristocratic privileges and the support of established tribal elites. Where Temujin was willing to promote men based on merit and loyalty rather than birth, Jamuka maintained the rigid hierarchies that had always characterized steppe society. The break between the two blood brothers came gradually through a series of misunderstandings and provocations that might have been resolved under different circumstances. But both men had ambitions that could not be reconciled, and both had followers who saw the other as an obstacle to their own advancement. When the final split came, it divided the Mongol tribes into two great factions, setting the stage for a civil war that would last for years and ultimately determine the future of the steppes. The war between Temujin and Jamuka was fought not just with swords and arrows, but with diplomacy, propaganda, and the careful cultivation of alliances. Both leaders understood that victory would depend not only on military skill, but on their ability to convince other tribes that their cause was just and their leadership was divinely ordained. They competed for the loyalty of shamans and the support of tribal elders, using every tool at their disposal to undermine their rivals' credibility and authority. Temujin's approach to this struggle revealed the strategic thinking that would later characterize his conquests. He understood that lasting victory required more than military success. It required the creation of new forms of loyalty and identity that could transcend the traditional tribal boundaries. He began to reorganize his followers along military lines rather than tribal ones, creating a system of decimal organization that would eventually become the foundation of the Mongol army. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 became the basic building blocks of his forces, with promotion based on merit rather than hereditary status. This innovation was revolutionary in the context of steppe society, where tribal identity and aristocratic privilege had been the primary organizing principles for centuries. By creating a military hierarchy that cut across traditional lines of kinship and allegiance, Temujin was laying the groundwork for a new form of political organization that could eventually unite all the tribes under a single leadership. The war also tested Temujin's ability to endure setbacks and learn from defeat. There were times when Jamuka's forces seemed to have the upper hand, when Temujin's followers were scattered and his own survival was in doubt. During one particularly difficult period, he was forced to hide in the mountains with only a small band of loyal followers, living off whatever they could hunt or forage, while avoiding the search parties sent out by his enemies. But these moments of adversity also revealed Temujin's greatest strength as a leader: his ability to inspire unwavering loyalty in his followers. Even when his cause seemed hopeless, men continued to risk their lives for him, drawn by his personal charisma and his promise of a better future. He had an intuitive understanding of what motivated people, whether it was the desire for advancement, the need for security, or the simple human longing for meaning and purpose. One of the most important aspects of Temujin's leadership was his treatment of conquered enemies. Unlike many steppe leaders who simply slaughtered their defeated foes or incorporated them as subordinates, Temujin offered genuine opportunities for advancement to those who proved their loyalty. This policy of incorporation, rather than elimination, allowed him to build a coalition that grew stronger with each victory, as former enemies became some of his most devoted followers. The turning point in the war came when several of Jamuka's most important allies defected to Temujin's side, bringing with them not only their own forces, but also valuable intelligence about their former leader's plans and weaknesses. These defections were the result of Temujin's patient cultivation of relationships and his reputation for treating his followers fairly, but they also reflected growing dissatisfaction with Jamuka's increasingly erratic and brutal behavior. As his position weakened, Jamuka became more desperate and more willing to use extreme measures to maintain his authority. He began executing followers who showed any sign of disloyalty and alienated potential allies with his increasingly paranoid and tyrannical behavior. This created a vicious cycle in which his harshness drove away supporters, which in turn made him more suspicious and harsh, until eventually even his closest allies began to question their loyalty to him. The final confrontation between Temujin and Jamuka took place at a location whose exact identity has been lost to history, but which was remembered by the Mongols as the place where the future of their people was decided. The battle itself was less decisive than the political maneuvering that surrounded it, for by this time, Jamuka had been abandoned by most of his followers, and was fighting with only a fraction of his former strength. When Jamukha was finally captured, Temujin faced one of the most difficult decisions of his career. The man who had been his closest friend and greatest rival was now at his mercy, and the choice he made would send a message to all the tribes about the kind of leader he intended to be. Traditional steppe law would have justified executing Jamukha as a traitor and enemy, but Temujin chose a different path. In a gesture that revealed both his magnanimity and his political sophistication, Temujin offered to restore Jamukha to a position of honor and authority, asking only for his loyalty in return. It was an offer that few leaders would have made to their greatest enemy, and it demonstrated Temujin's understanding that true strength came not from the ability to crush one's opponents, but from the ability to transform them into allies. But Jamukha, perhaps recognizing that he could never truly serve under the man who had defeated him, or perhaps understanding that his acceptance would be seen as weakness by others, refused the offer. Instead, he asked for an honorable death, acknowledging Temujin's victory and asking only that his blood not be spilled upon the ground, in accordance with Mongol beliefs about the spiritual significance of noble blood. Temujin granted this final request, and Jamukha was executed in a manner that preserved his honor while confirming Temujin's authority. The death of his former friend was a moment of personal anguish for Temujin, but it also marked the end of the last serious challenge to his leadership among the Mongol tribes. The way he handled Jamukha's capture and execution enhanced his reputation for both strength and honor, qualities that were essential for any leader who hoped to unite the fractious tribes of the steppes. With Jamukha's defeat, Temujin's position as the dominant leader among the Mongols was secure, but his ambitions extended far beyond the boundaries of his own people. The steppes were home to dozens of different tribes and peoples, each with their own traditions, languages, and allegiances. To create a truly unified confederation, Temujin would need to defeat or co-opt all of these groups, a task that would require years of careful diplomacy and strategic warfare. His next major challenge came from the Kerit, the tribe led by Togrul Khan, who had been his ally in the rescue of Berta, but who now viewed Temujin's growing power with increasing suspicion. Togrul was an experienced and cunning leader who understood that Temujin's ultimate goal was the unification of all the steppe tribes under his own authority, a development that would necessarily reduce the Kerit to a subordinate position. The conflict with the Kerit was complicated by the fact that Togrul's son, Sengum, was actively hostile to Temujin and worked to poison his father's mind against their former ally. Sengum represented the traditional aristocratic element in steppe society, those who saw Temujin's meritocratic innovations as a threat to their inherited privileges and status. He understood that if Temujin succeeded in uniting the tribes, the old order would be swept away and replaced by something entirely new. The war with the Kerit tested all of Temujin's skills as a strategist and diplomat. The Kerit were more numerous and better equipped than his own forces, and they had the advantage of fighting on familiar territory with the support of local allies. But Temujin had learned from his earlier conflicts and had developed new tactics specifically designed to counter the traditional steppe methods of warfare. One of his most important innovations was the use of coordinated attacks by multiple units operating under a unified command structure. Traditional steppe warfare had been characterized by individual acts of heroism and small-scale raids, but Temujin understood that larger battles required different approaches. He developed a system of signals and communications that allowed him to coordinate the movements of thousands of warriors across vast distances, turning the mobility that had always been the steppe people's greatest asset into a tool for large-scale strategic warfare. The decisive battle against the Kerayet took place during a fierce winter storm that reduced visibility to almost nothing and made movement extremely difficult. But Temujin used the weather to his advantage, launching a surprise attack that caught the Kerayet forces scattered and unprepared. The battle was fought in conditions of almost surreal difficulty, with warriors struggling through snow and ice while trying to distinguish friend from enemy in the swirling chaos of the storm. When the storm finally cleared, Genghis Khan was dead and the Kerayet were scattered and defeated. The victory established Temujin as the most powerful leader on the steppes, but it also marked a turning point in his relationship with the outside world. The defeat of such a well-established and respected tribe sent shockwaves throughout the region, alerting distant kingdoms and empires to the emergence of a new and potentially dangerous power. The conquest of the Kerayet was followed by campaigns against the Naimans, the Merkits, and the other remaining independent tribes. Each victory brought new challenges and opportunities, as Temujin was forced to integrate thousands of former enemies into his growing confederation while maintaining the loyalty of his original followers. The task required a delicate balancing act, as he needed to reward his old supporters, while also providing incentives for new ones to remain loyal. One of the keys to Temujin's success in this process was his ability to identify and promote talented individuals regardless of their background or tribal affiliation. He surrounded himself with a group of brilliant military commanders and administrators who shared his vision of a unified steppe confederation and who were willing to work together despite their diverse origins. These men, who would later become known as the great generals of the Mongol Empire, included figures like Subutai, Jebe, and Mukhali, each of whom brought unique skills and perspectives to Temujin's growing organization. Subutai, perhaps the greatest of all Mongol generals, was originally a member of the Uryankai tribe and had served as a blacksmith before joining Temujin's forces. His humble origins did not prevent him from rising to become one of the most important figures in the Mongol hierarchy, demonstrating the meritocratic principles that Temujin was trying to establish. Subutai's strategic brilliance and tactical innovations would later prove crucial in the Mongol conquest of China, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. Jebe, whose name meant arrow, was originally an enemy warrior who had wounded Temujin in battle, but was spared and eventually became one of his most trusted commanders. His story illustrated Temujin's policy of incorporating defeated enemies into his forces, a practice that not only strengthened his military capabilities, but also demonstrated his confidence in his ability to inspire loyalty even among former foes. Mukhali, a member of the Jalai tribe, became one of Temujin's most important political advisors and was eventually entrusted with the administration of conquered territories in northern China. His expertise in dealing with sedentary populations would prove invaluable as the Mongols expanded beyond the steppes and encountered the complex administrative challenges of governing agricultural societies. By the year 1206, Temujin had succeeded in uniting virtually all of the major tribes of the Mongolian steppes under his authority. The achievement was unprecedented in the history of the region, representing the culmination of decades of warfare, diplomacy, and careful political maneuvering. But Temujin understood that military conquest was only the first step in creating a lasting political structure. To transform his loose confederation of tribes into a stable empire, he would need to establish new institutions and systems of governance that could maintain unity and order across vast distances and diverse populations. The formal acknowledgement of Temujin's supreme authority came at a great gathering called a Kurultai, where representatives from all the major tribes came together to recognize him as their universal leader. At this assembly, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, a title that has been interpreted in various ways, but which essentially meant universal ruler or oceanic ruler. The ceremony was conducted according to ancient Mongol traditions, with shamans invoking the protection of the eternal blue sky and calling upon the spirits of the ancestors to bless the new Khan. The proclamation of Genghis Khan marked the beginning of a new era, not just for the Mongol tribes, but for much of the known world. The man who had once been an outcast child struggling to survive in the wilderness had become the leader of the largest land empire in human history. But this transformation was not yet complete, for Genghis Khan's ambitions extended far beyond the steppes of Mongolia. The newly proclaimed Khan began almost immediately to implement a series of reforms designed to consolidate his power and prepare his forces for the conquests that would follow. The decimal system of military organization that he had developed during his rise to power was formalized and extended throughout the entire Mongol Confederation. Every male of fighting age was assigned to a unit of 10, 100, 1,000, or 10,000, with clear chains of command and responsibility that cut across traditional tribal boundaries. Perhaps even more important than the military reforms were the social and legal changes that Genghis Khan instituted. He proclaimed a new law code called the Yasa, which established uniform standards of behavior and justice for all members of the Confederation. The Yasa was notable for its relative simplicity and its emphasis on loyalty, discipline, and meritocracy. It prohibited theft, adultery, and bearing false witness, while also establishing rules for military conduct and the treatment of conquered peoples. One of the most revolutionary aspects of the Yasa was its provision for religious tolerance. Unlike many medieval legal codes, which were based on specific religious traditions, the Yasa allowed members of the Confederation to practice whatever religion they chose, as long as they remained loyal to the Khan. This policy of religious tolerance would later become one of the distinctive characteristics of the Mongol Empire and would help to explain its remarkable success in governing diverse populations across vast territories. Genghis Khan also established a new system of communication and administration that would allow him to maintain control over his far-flung territories. The Pony Express system, known as the Yam, created a network of relay stations that could carry messages across thousands of miles in a matter of days. This innovation was crucial to the functioning of the empire, as it allowed the Khan to coordinate military campaigns, gather intelligence, and maintain contact with his commanders and administrators regardless of distance. The creation of these new institutions was accompanied by a systematic effort to break down the traditional tribal identities that had divided the steppe peoples for centuries. Genghis Khan deliberately mixed members of different tribes within his military units and administrative structures, forcing them to work together and develop new loyalties that transcended their old ethnic and kinship bonds. This policy of integration was often resented by traditionalists, but it was essential to creating the unified command structure that would make the Mongol conquests possible. With his domestic reforms well underway, Genghis Khan began to turn his attention to the world beyond the steppes. The first major target of his expansionist ambitions was the Western Sea, a kingdom that controlled the important trade routes between China and Central Asia. The Western Sea was a Tibetan state that had grown wealthy from its control of the Silk Road trade, but it was also isolated and vulnerable to attack from the north. The campaign against the Western Sea served multiple purposes for Genghis Khan. It provided his newly unified forces with their first major test against a sedentary enemy. It opened up new sources of wealth and resources. And it established the Mongols as a power that neighboring kingdoms would have to take seriously. The Western Xia possessed sophisticated fortifications and military technologies that were unfamiliar to the Mongols, forcing them to develop new tactics and strategies for siege warfare. The conquest of the Western Xia's capital city required a long and difficult siege, during which the Mongols demonstrated their remarkable adaptability and willingness to learn from their enemies. They captured Chinese engineers and siege specialists, forcing them to share their knowledge of military technology and fortification design. They also developed new methods for coordinating large-scale military operations, including the use of smoke signals and drum codes to communicate across the battlefield. The fall of the Western Xia was followed by the systematic incorporation of its population and resources into the growing Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan's treatment of the conquered kingdom established many of the patterns that would characterize later Mongol conquests. Skilled craftsmen, scholars, and administrators were spared and relocated to serve the Mongol state, while those who had resisted were punished severely. The kingdom's wealth was distributed among the Mongol warriors, but a significant portion was also set aside to fund future military campaigns. The success of the Western Xia campaign encouraged Genghis Khan to set his sights on an even more ambitious target, the Jin dynasty of northern China. The Jin were a Jurchen state that had conquered northern China from the Song dynasty earlier in the century and had established themselves as one of the most powerful empires in East Asia. They possessed vast wealth, sophisticated military technology, and millions of subjects, making them both an attractive target and a formidable opponent. The war against the Jin dynasty would prove to be one of the longest and most challenging of Genghis Khan's career. The Jin possessed heavily fortified cities, professional armies equipped with the latest military technology, and a complex system of alliances and tributaries that extended throughout northern China and into Central Asia. They also had the advantage of fighting on familiar territory with the support of a large and loyal population. But the Mongols brought their own advantages to the conflict. Their superior mobility allowed them to strike rapidly and unpredictably, avoiding the Jin's main armies while attacking their supply lines and communications. Their harsh treatment of cities that resisted served as a warning to others, often causing fortifications to surrender without a fight rather than face the consequences of defiance. Most importantly, their unified command structure allowed them to coordinate operations across multiple fronts, something that the Jin, with their more traditional military organization, found difficult to counter. The Mongol invasion of Jin territory began in 1211 and continued for more than 2 decades, involving some of the largest and most destructive military campaigns in medieval history. The Mongols adapted their traditional steppe tactics to the requirements of warfare in agricultural regions, learning to use captured siege equipment and incorporating Chinese military engineers into their forces. They also developed new strategies for governing conquered territories, establishing systems of administration that could extract resources and manpower while maintaining order among the diverse populations they now ruled. One of the most significant aspects of the Jin campaign was the way it transformed the Mongol military from a traditional steppe confederation into a professional imperial army. The long duration of the conflict and the complex challenges it presented forced the Mongols to develop new forms of military organization, logistics, and strategy. They learned to conduct extended sieges, coordinate operations across vast distances, and manage the complex political relationships that came with ruling agricultural populations. The siege of Beijing, the Jin capital, represented the culmination of Genghis Khan's military evolution. The city was one of the largest and most heavily fortified in the world, with massive walls, sophisticated defenses, and a garrison of experienced soldiers. The siege lasted for more than a year and required the Mongols to master technologies and tactics that were completely foreign to their steppe heritage. During the siege, Genghis Khan demonstrated the same strategic patience and psychological warfare that had characterized his earlier conquests. He surrounded the city completely, cutting off all supplies and communications, while simultaneously offering generous terms to any defenders who would surrender. He also used captured Chinese engineers to construct siege equipment and develop new methods for breaching the city's formidable walls. The fall of Beijing in 1215 marked a turning point not just in the war against the Jin, but in the entire character of the Mongol Empire. The capture of such a great city, with its vast wealth and sophisticated administrative systems, provided the Mongols with resources and expertise that would prove crucial in their later conquests. It also established Genghis Khan's reputation as a conqueror capable of defeating even the most powerful and well-defended enemies. But the conquest of Beijing also presented new challenges that would test Genghis Khan's abilities as an administrator and ruler. The city contained hundreds of thousands of civilians, vast amounts of wealth, and complex systems of government and commerce that were completely foreign to the Mongols' nomadic experience. The decisions that Genghis Khan made about how to govern this newly conquered territory would establish precedents that would influence the development of the Mongol Empire for generations to come. Genghis Khan's approach to governing Beijing and other conquered Chinese territories reflected his pragmatic understanding of the differences between nomadic and sedentary societies. Rather than attempting to impose Mongol customs and institutions on the Chinese population, he chose to adapt existing systems of government and administration to serve his purposes. Chinese officials who demonstrated their loyalty were retained in their positions, while new Mongol administrators were installed at the highest levels to ensure ultimate control remained in Mongol hands. This policy of administrative adaptation was accompanied by a systematic effort to extract maximum value from the conquered territories. The Mongols imposed heavy taxes and tribute payments on their Chinese subjects, while also recruiting skilled craftsmen, scholars, and military specialists to serve the empire in other regions. The wealth flowing from China would fund Genghis Khan's later conquests and help to transform the Mongol Empire from a nomadic confederation into a true world power. While the war against the Jin continued to rage in northern China, Genghis Khan was also planning even more ambitious campaigns that would extend Mongol power far beyond East Asia. His attention was increasingly drawn to the west, where the wealthy kingdoms of Central Asia and the Islamic world offered tempting targets for conquest. The decision to expand westward would ultimately lead to some of the most dramatic and destructive campaigns in military history, but it would also establish the Mongol Empire as a truly global power. The immediate catalyst for westward expansion came from an unexpected source: a trade dispute with the Khwarezmid Empire, which controlled much of modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. The Khwarezmids were a Turkic dynasty that had built their power on control of the lucrative trade routes connecting East and West. They were wealthy, sophisticated, and confident in their ability to deal with any threats from the distant steppes of Mongolia. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a large trade caravan to the Khwarezmid city of Otrar, both to establish commercial relations and to gather intelligence about the empire's defenses and capabilities. The caravan was led by Muslim merchants who had pledged their loyalty to the Mongol Khan, and it carried a substantial amount of gold, silver, and other valuables intended to demonstrate the Mongols' wealth and peaceful intentions. But the governor of Otrar either through greed or suspicion, ordered the caravan seized and its members executed as spies. When news of this action reached Genghis Khan, he initially sought a diplomatic solution, sending ambassadors to the Khwarezmid Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad demanding compensation and the punishment of those responsible. The Shah's response was to execute one of the ambassadors and send the others back with their beards burned off, a grave insult in the diplomatic customs of the time. This sequence of events provided Genghis Khan with the justification he needed for a full-scale invasion of the Khwarezmid Empire. But the campaign that followed was motivated by more than just revenge for the mistreatment of merchants and diplomats. Genghis Khan had long recognized that the wealth and strategic position of Central Asia made it a crucial target for Mongol expansion, and the Khwarezmid insult simply provided the pretext for a war that had probably been inevitable. The invasion of the Khwarezmid Empire, which began in 1219, would prove to be one of the most devastating military campaigns in medieval history. Genghis Khan assembled an army of nearly 200,000 warriors, the largest force he had ever commanded, drawing troops not only from the traditional Mongol tribes, but also from the conquered peoples of China and Central Asia. This multinational army reflected the evolution of the Mongol Empire from a nomadic confederation into a sophisticated military machine capable of projecting power across vast distances. The campaign began with a strategic deception that demonstrated Genghis Khan's growing mastery of psychological warfare. Rather than following the expected route through the mountain passes that connected Mongolia with Central Asia, the Mongol army took a circuitous path through the Kizilkum Desert, appearing suddenly on the northern borders of the Khwarezmid Empire, where they were least expected. This unexpected approach allowed them to capture several key cities before the Khwarezmids could organize an effective defense. The speed and coordination of the Mongol advance caught the Khwarezmid forces completely off guard. Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad had prepared to defend against a traditional nomadic raid, not a systematic conquest, by a professional army equipped with the latest siege technology. His forces were scattered across hundreds of miles of frontier, manning isolated fortresses and garrison towns that were designed to repel small-scale attacks, but were vulnerable to the kind of coordinated assault that the Mongols were now capable of mounting. The first major city to fall was Otrar, where the original insult to Genghis Khan's merchants had taken place. The siege of Otrar lasted for several months and became a symbol of Mongol determination and ruthlessness. When the city finally fell, Genghis Khan ordered that it be completely destroyed and its population massacred, with the governor who had started the conflict being executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears. The fate of Otrar sent a clear message to other cities throughout the empire. Resistance would be met with total destruction. Following the fall of Otrar, the Mongol army divided into several columns that advanced simultaneously along different routes, a strategy that maximized their psychological impact, while making it impossible for the Khwarezmids to concentrate their forces against any single threat. Genghis Khan personally led one column toward the great city of Bukhara, while his sons Jochi, Chagatai, and Ogadai commanded other forces that moved against targets throughout the empire. The siege of Bukhara in 1220 marked a new phase in Mongol warfare, demonstrating their ability to capture even the most sophisticated urban centers through a combination of military skill and psychological pressure. Bukhara was one of the greatest cities of the Islamic world, a center of learning and commerce that had stood for centuries as a symbol of Central Asian civilization. Its massive walls and professional garrison made it appear impregnable, But the Mongols had learned much about siege warfare from their campaigns in China. Rather than attempting a direct assault on the city's formidable defenses, Genghis Khan employed a strategy of gradual strangulation. He surrounded Bukhara completely, cutting off all supplies and communication with the outside world, while simultaneously using captured siege engines to bombard the walls and gates. He also employed psychological warfare on an unprecedented scale, spreading rumors about Mongol invincibility and the terrible fate that awaited cities that resisted. When Bukhara finally surrendered, Genghis Khan's treatment of the city and its population established patterns that would be repeated throughout the conquest of Central Asia. The city's scholars, craftsmen, and administrators were spared, and many were relocated to serve the Mongol Empire in other regions. The general population was allowed to live, but was required to pay massive tribute and provide soldiers for future Mongol campaigns. The city's fortifications were dismantled and its ruling elite was executed, ensuring that Bukhara could never again serve as a center of resistance. The psychological impact of Bukhara's fall reverberated throughout the Islamic world. Here was a city that had been considered one of the jewels of Muslim civilization, reduced to submission by nomadic warriors from the distant steppes. The news of its capture spread along the trade routes and diplomatic networks that connected the various kingdoms and empires of the region, carrying with it tales of Mongol military prowess that grew more terrifying with each retelling. The conquest of Bukhara was quickly followed by the even more dramatic siege of Samarkand, another of Central Asia's greatest cities. Samarkand was larger and more heavily fortified than Bukhara, with a garrison of over 100,000 soldiers and defenses that had been strengthened specifically to resist Mongol attack. But the city's defenders had been demoralized by the news from Bukhara and other fallen cities, and many were already questioning whether resistance was worthwhile. The siege of Samarkand lasted only 5 days, a remarkably short time for such a massive fortification. The rapid fall of the city was due partly to the effectiveness of Mongol siege tactics, but also to the collapse of morale among the defenders. When it became clear that the Mongols had surrounded the city completely and that no relief force was coming, many of the garrisons simply abandoned their posts and fled. Those who remained found themselves overwhelmed by the coordinated assault that followed. Genghis Khan's treatment of Samarkand was somewhat more lenient than his handling of Otrar, reflecting his growing understanding of the need to balance terror with pragmatism. The city's craftsmen and scholars were spared, and many were recruited into Mongol service, while the general population was allowed to remain after paying a substantial tribute. However, the city's military leadership was executed, and its fortifications were destroyed, ensuring that it could not serve as a base for future resistance. While Genghis Khan was conquering the great cities of Central Asia, his generals were conducting equally successful campaigns throughout the Khwarezmid Empire. Jebe and Subutai, two of his most capable commanders, led a remarkable expedition that pursued the fleeing Shah across Iran and into the Caucasus, demonstrating the Mongols' ability to conduct operations across thousands of miles of unfamiliar territory. The pursuit of Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad became one of the most famous episodes of the entire campaign. The Shah, realizing that his empire was collapsing around him, abandoned his remaining forces and fled westward, hoping to reach safety in the lands controlled by his allies, or perhaps to escape entirely to Egypt or the Byzantine Empire. But Jebe and Subutai followed him relentlessly, their small but highly mobile force covering vast distances at remarkable speed. The chase led through some of the most difficult terrain in the world, across the deserts of eastern Iran, through the mountain passes of the Caucasus, and into the steppes of southern Russia. Along the way, the two Mongol generals gained invaluable intelligence about the lands and peoples of Western Asia, information that would prove crucial in planning future campaigns. They also demonstrated the Mongol Empire's growing reach and capabilities, showing that no enemy was beyond their grasp. Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad died on a small island in the Caspian Sea, exhausted and broken by his flight from the Mongol armies. His death effectively ended organized resistance to the Mongol conquest, though fighting would continue in various parts of the former Khwarezmid Empire for several more months. The pursuit of the Shah had served multiple purposes. It eliminated the primary symbol of resistance to Mongol rule. It provided valuable reconnaissance of new territories, and it demonstrated to potential enemies throughout the region that flight was not an option. The conquest of the Khwarezmid Empire was completed with the systematic reduction of the remaining fortified cities and the establishment of Mongol administrative control throughout the region. This process required not only military skill, but also considerable diplomatic and administrative expertise, as the Mongols had to create new systems of government that could manage the diverse populations and complex economies of Central Asia. Genghis Khan's approach to governing the conquered territories reflected his growing sophistication as a ruler and administrator. Rather than simply imposing Mongol customs and institutions on the conquered populations, he chose to adapt and modify existing systems to serve his purposes. Local administrators who demonstrated their loyalty were retained in their positions, while Mongol overseers were installed at key points in the hierarchy to ensure ultimate control remained in Mongol hands. The economic integration of Central Asia into the Mongol Empire proved to be one of the most significant long-term consequences of the conquest. The region's position at the crossroads of the great trade routes connecting East and West made it enormously valuable to an empire that was increasingly dependent on commercial revenues. Under Mongol rule, trade flourished as never before, protected by the empire's military power and facilitated by its uniform, legal and administrative systems. The religious and cultural implications of the Mongol conquest were equally profound. The Mongols' policy of religious tolerance, enshrined in the Yasa, allowed the diverse religious communities of Central Asia to continue practicing their faiths while serving the empire. This approach not only reduced resistance to Mongol rule, but also allowed the empire to benefit from the knowledge and skills of scholars and administrators from many different traditions. The conquest of Central Asia also marked an important evolution in Mongol military organization and tactics. The challenges of governing sedentary populations and managing complex urban economies required new forms of expertise that went far beyond traditional nomadic skills. The Mongols adapted by incorporating specialists from the conquered territories into their administrative and military hierarchies, creating a truly multicultural imperial system. While the main body of the Mongol army was completing the conquest of Central Asia, Jebe and Subutai continued their remarkable expedition into regions that no Mongol force had ever seen. After the death of the Khwarezmid Shah, they turned north into the Caucasus, where they encountered the various Christian and Muslim peoples who controlled the mountain passes and the fertile valleys beyond. The Mongol expedition through the Caucasus was as much a reconnaissance mission as a military campaign. Jebe and Subutai were gathering intelligence about the lands and peoples of the region, assessing their military capabilities and political organization, and establishing contacts that might prove useful in future campaigns. They also continued to demonstrate Mongol military prowess, defeating local armies and capturing fortified positions with the same efficiency they had shown in Central Asia. From the Caucasus, the two Mongol generals moved north into the steppes of southern Russia, where they encountered the Kipchaks, a Turkic nomadic people who controlled much of the region between the Caspian and Black Seas. The Kipchaks were skilled horsemen and warriors, similar in many ways to the Mongols themselves, but they lacked the unified organization and systematic approach to warfare that had made the Mongols so successful. The conflict between the Mongols and the Kipchaks quickly escalated into a major campaign that drew in the Russian princes who controlled the settled regions to the north. The Russians had long-standing relationships with the Kipchaks, who served as both trading partners and military allies in their conflicts with other powers. When the Kipchaks appealed for help against the Mongol invasion, several Russian princes agreed to join forces with them. The coalition army that marched south to confront Jebe and Subutai included troops from Kiev, Chernigov, Galicia, and several other Russian principalities, representing one of the largest military forces that the region had assembled in decades. The Russians were confident in their ability to defeat what they assumed was a relatively small raiding party that had wandered far from its home base, but they seriously underestimated both the size and the capabilities of the Mongol force. The Battle of the Kalka River, fought in 1223, became one of the most decisive engagements in medieval military history. The Russian and Kipchak coalition army was completely destroyed by the Mongols, who employed their traditional tactics of feigned retreat and coordinated attacks to devastating effect. The Russian princes who had led the expedition were captured and executed, and their armies were scattered across the steppes. The victory at Kalka demonstrated that the Mongols could defeat even the most powerful European armies, using the same tactics and strategies that had proven successful in Asia. It also provided them with valuable intelligence about the military capabilities and political organization of the Russian principalities, information that would prove crucial when they returned in force 2 decades later. After their victory at Kalka, Jebe and Subutai continued their extraordinary journey, moving east through the steppes north of the Caspian Sea and eventually rejoining Genghis Khan's main army in Central Asia. Their expedition had covered more than 8,000 miles through some of the most difficult terrain in the world, demonstrating the remarkable mobility and endurance that were characteristic of Mongol warfare. The intelligence gathered during this expedition would prove invaluable in planning future Mongol campaigns in Eastern Europe and Russia. Jebe and Subutai had mapped the major routes and geographical features of the region, assessed the military capabilities of its various peoples, and identified the political divisions that could be exploited in future conquests. Their report to Genghis Khan provided him with a comprehensive understanding of the lands and peoples to the west, setting the stage for the later Mongol invasions of Europe. By 1225, the conquest of the Khwarezmid Empire was essentially complete, and Genghis Khan began to turn his attention back to the unfinished business in East Asia. The Jin dynasty in northern China remained unconquered, despite years of warfare, and the Western Xia had shown signs of renewed independence. Both situations required his personal attention, as they represented potential threats to the stability of the empire's eastern territories. The return to Mongolia and the resumption of the campaigns in East Asia marked the beginning of the final phase of Genghis Khan's military career. He was now in his 60s, an advanced age for a nomadic warrior, and the long years of constant campaigning had taken their toll on his health. But his strategic vision remained as clear as ever, and he was determined to complete the unification of East Asia under Mongol rule before passing power to his successors. The campaign against the Western Xia, which began in 1226, was in many ways a return to the Khan's roots. The Western Xia were a familiar enemy whose territory and military capabilities were well known to the Mongols. The campaign could be conducted using traditional steppe tactics, without the complex siege warfare and urban administration that had characterized the conquests in Central Asia and China. But the Western Xia campaign also revealed the physical toll that decades of warfare had taken on Genghis Khan. Contemporary sources describe him as increasingly frail and prone to illness, and there are suggestions that he may have been suffering from injuries sustained in earlier battles or from the effects of diseases contracted during his travels. Despite these physical limitations, he insisted on personally leading the campaign, perhaps recognizing that this might be his final opportunity to lead his warriors in battle. The siege of the Western Xia capital proved to be a prolonged and difficult affair, lasting through the harsh winter of 1226 to 1227. The city's defenders, knowing that surrender would likely mean death or enslavement, fought with desperate courage, while the Mongol attackers found themselves hampered by supply problems and the effects of the bitter cold. The campaign dragged on for months, with neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage. It was during this siege that Genghis Khan's health finally began to fail completely. The exact nature of his final illness remains unclear, with different sources attributing his decline to various causes, including injuries from a fall from his horse, complications from earlier wounds, or simply the accumulated effects of a lifetime of warfare and hardship. What is certain is that by the spring of 1227, it had become clear to his closest advisors that the great Khan was dying. Genghis Khan's approach to his own mortality reflected the same strategic thinking that had characterized his entire career. Rather than simply naming a successor and hoping for the best, he spent his final weeks carefully planning the transition of power and the future direction of the empire. He met privately with each of his sons, assessing their strengths and weaknesses and discussing their roles in the empire's future. He also consulted with his closest advisors about the challenges that would face the empire after his death. The choice of a successor was complicated by the fact that Mongol tradition favored the youngest son, while practical considerations suggested that the empire needed a leader with proven military and administrative abilities. Genghis Khan's eldest son, Jochi, had died the previous year, removing one potential claimant, but also creating questions about the succession rights of his descendants. The remaining sons each had different qualifications and different bases of support within the empire. Ultimately, Genghis Khan chose his third son, Ogedai, as his heir and successor. Ogedai had proven himself to be both a capable military commander and a skilled administrator, with a reputation for fairness and good judgment that made him acceptable to most factions within the empire. Perhaps equally important, he had shown the ability to work effectively with his brothers and other members of the ruling family, a quality that would be essential for maintaining unity after Genghis Khan's death. The decision to name Ogedai as successor was accompanied by detailed instructions about the future governance of the empire. Genghis Khan divided his territories among his sons, with each receiving a specific ulus or administrative division to govern under the overall authority of the great Khan. This system was designed to maintain family unity while preventing the empire from fragmenting into completely independent kingdoms. Genghis Khan also provided guidance about future military campaigns and territorial expansion. He identified China as the primary target for future conquest, recognizing that the complete subjugation of the Jin dynasty and the Song Empire would provide the resources necessary to maintain Mongol power. He also discussed the potential for westward expansion, though he cautioned that such campaigns should only be undertaken after the eastern territories had been fully consolidated. In August 1227, as the siege of the western Xia capital neared its conclusion, Genghis Khan died in his tent, surrounded by his closest family members and advisors. The exact circumstances of his death were kept secret, and his body was transported back to Mongolia for burial in a location that has never been definitively identified. According to Mongol tradition, all those who witnessed the funeral procession were killed to ensure that the gravesite would remain hidden forever. The death of Genghis Khan marked the end of an era, but it did not mark the end of the Mongol Empire. The institutions and systems that he had created proved remarkably durable, and the empire continued to expand for several more decades under his successors. But his death did represent the passing of one of history's most remarkable individuals, a man who had transformed himself from an outcast child into the ruler of the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The immediate aftermath of Genghis Khan's death demonstrated the effectiveness of the succession arrangements he had made. Ögedei was accepted as Great Khan without significant opposition, and the various administrative and military structures of the empire continued to function smoothly. The siege of the western Xia capital was completed successfully, and the kingdom was finally incorporated into the Mongol Empire as Genghis Khan had intended. But the true measure of Genghis Khan's achievement lay not in the territories he had conquered or the enemies he had defeated, but in the lasting impact of the systems and institutions he had created. The Mongol Empire would continue to expand under his successors, eventually stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean and encompassing a significant portion of the human population. The trade routes, administrative systems, and cultural exchanges that developed under Mongol rule would reshape the medieval world and lay the foundations for the modern global economy. The military innovations pioneered by Genghis Khan and his generals would influence warfare for centuries to come. The decimal system of organization, the emphasis on mobility and coordination, and the integration of different military traditions into a unified force became models that were studied and imitated by military leaders throughout the world. The Mongol approach to siege warfare, in particular, represented a revolution in military technology and tactics that changed the nature of urban warfare. Perhaps even more significant were the administrative and legal innovations that Genghis Khan introduced. The Yasa, with its emphasis on meritocracy and religious tolerance, provided a framework for governing diverse populations that was far more flexible and inclusive than most medieval legal systems. The Pony Express network established patterns of communication and administration that would be adopted by later empires and nation-states. The economic impact of the Mongol Empire was equally profound. Under Mongol protection, trade flourished along the Silk Road and other major commercial routes, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between distant regions. The empire's uniform currency and legal system reduced transaction costs and made long-distance commerce more profitable and predictable than ever before. The cultural and intellectual consequences of Mongol rule were perhaps the most complex and long-lasting of all. The empire's policy of religious tolerance allowed different faith traditions to interact and influence each other in unprecedented ways. Buddhist monasteries, Islamic madrasas, Christian churches, and Confucian academies all operated within the same political framework, creating opportunities for intellectual exchange that would have been impossible under more restrictive regimes. The Mongol conquest also facilitated the spread of technologies and scientific knowledge across vast distances. Printing, gunpowder, the compass, and numerous other innovations moved along the trade routes protected by Mongol armies accelerating the pace of technological development and cultural exchange. Medical knowledge, mathematical techniques, and astronomical observations were shared between scholars in China, Persia, and Europe, contributing to advances that would eventually lead to the scientific revolution. The impact of Mongol rule on the arts was equally significant. The empire's patronage of artists and craftsmen from different traditions led to the development of new artistic styles that combined elements from multiple cultures. Persian miniature painting, Chinese ceramics, and Islamic architecture all showed the influence of this cultural mixing, creating artistic traditions that would persist long after the empire itself had dissolved. The demographic consequences of the Mongol conquests were enormous and complex. While the initial invasions undoubtedly caused significant population losses in many regions, the long-term effects of Mongol rule were often more positive. The empire's emphasis on trade and urbanization led to population growth in many areas, while the mixing of different ethnic and cultural groups created new identities and communities that transcended traditional boundaries. The political legacy of the Mongol Empire was perhaps the most ambiguous aspect of its impact. On one hand, the empire demonstrated that it was possible to create unified political structures spanning vast distances and diverse populations. The administrative techniques and governmental institutions developed by the Mongols provided models that were later adopted by other empires and modern nation-states. On the other hand, the empire's ultimate fragmentation into competing khanates showed the limitations of personal rule and the challenges of maintaining unity across such vast territories. The civil wars that eventually broke out between different branches of Genghis Khan's family demonstrated that even the most sophisticated administrative systems could not completely overcome the centrifugal forces that threatened large empires. The military legacy of Genghis Khan extended far beyond the specific battles and campaigns he conducted. His approach to warfare, with its emphasis on speed, coordination, and psychological impact, became a model that was studied and imitated by military leaders for centuries. The principle of concentrating superior force at decisive points, the use of intelligence and reconnaissance to gather information about enemy capabilities, and the integration of different military specialties into unified forces all became standard features of successful military organizations. The Mongol approach to logistics and supply also revolutionized military thinking. The ability to move large armies across vast distances while maintaining their fighting effectiveness required sophisticated planning and organization. The techniques developed by Mongol quartermasters for managing supply lines, organizing transportation, and coordinating the movement of men and materials became essential elements of modern military science. Perhaps most importantly, Genghis Khan's career demonstrated the importance of adaptability and innovation in military affairs. His willingness to adopt new technologies, incorporate foreign specialists into his forces, and modify traditional tactics to meet new challenges show that successful military leaders must be lifelong learners who are constantly seeking to improve their capabilities. The social legacy of the Mongol Empire was equally significant. The empire's meritocratic principles challenged traditional aristocratic hierarchies and demonstrated that talent and loyalty could be more important than birth and hereditary status. While this did not lead to the complete elimination of social stratification, it did create opportunities for advancement that had not existed in many traditional societies. The Mongol emphasis on religious tolerance also had lasting effects on the development of pluralistic societies. The principle that different religious communities could coexist peacefully under a single political authority became an important precedent for later efforts to create inclusive and diverse societies. This approach would eventually influence the development of modern concepts of religious freedom and cultural diversity. The role of women in Mongol society was notably different from their status in many contemporary civilizations. Mongol women enjoyed greater freedom and authority than their counterparts in China, the Islamic world, or medieval Europe. They could own property, engage in trade, and exercise political influence in ways that were often forbidden to women in other societies. This tradition of female empowerment, while not complete or universal, provided an alternative model of gender relations that would influence later developments. The environmental impact of the Mongol Empire was complex and varied across different regions. In some areas, the disruption caused by military campaigns and population movements led to temporary ecological damage. In others, the empire's emphasis on trade and communication led to the introduction of new crops, livestock, and agricultural techniques that improved productivity and sustainability. The empire's pastoral heritage also meant that Mongol rulers generally had a better understanding of ecological relationships and environmental management than many sedentary civilizations. Their experience with managing grazing lands and maintaining the health of livestock herds provided insights that were sometimes applied to the administration of agricultural territories. The linguistic legacy of the Mongol Empire was profound and lasting. The need to communicate across the diverse territories of the empire led to the development of new linguistic tools and the spread of existing languages into new regions. Mongolian itself became a diplomatic language in many parts of Asia, while the empire facilitated the spread of Chinese, Persian, and Arabic into new areas. The development of written Mongolian using a script adapted from the Uyghur alphabet was one of Genghis Khan's most important cultural innovations. This writing system not only preserved Mongol oral traditions, but also facilitated the administration of the empire and the development of a more sophisticated literary culture. The Mongolian script would continue to be used for centuries, preserving the language and culture of the Mongol people through periods of political fragmentation and foreign domination. The legal legacy of the Mongol Empire, embodied in the Yasa, provided a model for creating unified legal systems that could govern diverse populations. The emphasis on clear, simple laws that applied equally to all subjects, regardless of their ethnic or religious background, was a significant innovation in medieval jurisprudence. While the specific provisions of the Yasa were often harsh by modern standards, the principle of legal uniformity became an important precedent for later legal developments. The commercial legacy of the empire was perhaps its most immediately practical contribution to world development. The protection and facilitation of trade that characterized Mongol rule created economic networks and commercial practices that would persist long after the empire's political fragmentation. The development of credit systems, standardized weights and measures, and commercial law provided the foundation for the expansion of international trade that would eventually lead to the modern global economy. The diplomatic legacy of the Mongol Empire was equally significant. The empire's approach to international relations, with its emphasis on formal diplomatic protocols, the exchange of ambassadors, and the negotiation of complex treaties, helped to establish standards for international conduct that would influence diplomatic practice for centuries. The Mongol diplomatic corps, which included representatives from many different cultural and linguistic backgrounds, provided a model for professional diplomatic services. The educational and intellectual legacy of the empire was complex and multifaceted. While the initial conquests undoubtedly disrupted many centers of learning, the empire's eventual patronage of scholarship and its facilitation of intellectual exchange led to significant advances in many fields. The translation of texts between different languages, the exchange of ideas between scholars from different traditions, and the development of new educational institutions all contributed to the advancement of human knowledge. The architectural legacy of the Mongol Empire reflected the synthesis of different building traditions that occurred under Mongol rule. While the Mongols themselves had little architectural tradition beyond the portable structures needed for nomadic life, they became patrons of monumental architecture that combined elements from Chinese, Islamic, and other traditions. The buildings constructed under Mongol patronage often reflected this cultural mixing, creating new architectural styles that would influence later developments. The medical legacy of the empire was particularly important, as the movement of people and ideas across the empire's vast territories led to the exchange of medical knowledge and practices between different traditions. Chinese medicine, Islamic medical science, and traditional steppe healing practices all influenced each other under Mongol rule, leading to advances in medical understanding and practice that would benefit millions of people. The agricultural legacy of the empire included the introduction of new crops and farming techniques across vast distances. The movement of people and goods facilitated by Mongol rule led to the spread of agricultural innovations that improved food production and dietary diversity in many regions. New varieties of grains, fruits, and vegetables were introduced to areas where they had never been grown before, contributing to improved nutrition and population growth. The technological legacy of the empire was perhaps most visible in the rapid spread of innovations like printing, gunpowder, and navigational instruments. The Mongol trade networks provided channels through which these technologies could move much more rapidly than they would have under normal circumstances, accelerating the pace of technological development and cultural change. As the years passed after Genghis Khan's death, the empire he had created would face new challenges and undergo significant changes. His successors would expand the empire even further, conquering the Song dynasty in China, invading Europe, and establishing Mongol rule over much of the Islamic world. But they would also face the inevitable problems that came with governing such a vast and diverse territory. The empire would eventually fragment into separate khanates, each following its own path of development. The Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia would all claim to be the legitimate heirs of Genghis Khan's legacy, but each would develop its own distinct identity and institutions. Despite this political fragmentation, the cultural, economic, and technological exchanges that had been initiated under Mongol rule would continue to shape the development of Eurasia for centuries to come. The networks of communication and trade that had been established would persist, facilitating continued interaction between distant regions and cultures. The memory of Genghis Khan himself would evolve and change over time, taking on different meanings for different peoples and cultures. In Mongolia, he would be remembered as the founder of the nation and the greatest of all Mongol leaders. In China, he would be seen as one of many foreign conquerors who had ruled the Middle Kingdom. In the Islamic world, his conquests would be remembered as a great catastrophe, while in Europe, he would become a symbol of the mysterious and dangerous East. Modern scholarship has attempted to create a more balanced and comprehensive understanding of Genghis Khan and his empire, recognizing both the destructive aspects of the Mongol conquests and their positive contributions to world development. This more nuanced view sees the Mongol Empire as a crucial link between the ancient and modern worlds, a period when the foundations of our current global civilization were being laid. The story of Genghis Khan ultimately transcends the details of specific battles and conquests to become a meditation on the nature of leadership, the dynamics of cultural change, and the complex relationships between different civilizations. His life and career illuminate the ways in which individual ambition and ability can intersect with historical circumstances to produce changes that reshape the entire world. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Genghis Khan's story is not the extent of his conquests or the duration of his empire, but the way in which a single individual, born into obscurity in one of the world's most remote regions, was able to create institutions and initiate processes that would influence the development of human civilization for centuries to come. His legacy reminds us that history is not simply the product of vast impersonal forces, but is also shaped by the vision, determination, and actions of exceptional individuals who dare to imagine and work toward a different future. The personal mythology surrounding Genghis Khan grew even as his earthly remains were carried across the steppes to their eternal resting place. The Mongol shamans who performed the burial rites spoke of signs and portents that accompanied his death. The appearance of unusual stars, the behavior of animals, and the quality of the wind itself. These observations, whether real or imagined, became part of the sacred narrative that would surround his memory for generations to come. The secret burial, conducted according to ancient Mongol traditions, was designed to ensure that his grave would never become a shrine or a focus for political opposition. Yet the very mystery of its location only added to the Khan's mystique, creating legends that would persist for centuries about hidden treasures, guardian spirits, and the eventual return of the great conqueror in his people's hour of greatest need. The immediate succession of Ögedei proceeded smoothly, but it also marked the beginning of a gradual transformation in the nature of Mongol leadership. Where Genghis Khan had been both a military commander and a spiritual figure, his successors would increasingly delegate military responsibilities to professional generals while focusing on the administrative challenges of governing a vast empire. This evolution reflected the changing needs of the empire, but also highlighted the unique combination of qualities that had made Genghis Khan so effective as a leader. The expansion of the empire under Ögedei and his successors would eventually dwarf even Genghis Khan's conquests. The complete conquest of the Jin dynasty, the invasion of Europe, the destruction of Baghdad, and the conquest of the Song dynasty would all occur in the decades following his death. Yet, these later conquests were built upon the foundation of institutions, strategies, and alliances that Genghis Khan had created, demonstrating the lasting value of his organizational innovations. The Mongol conquest of Europe, led by Subutai and other generals trained by Genghis Khan, showed how effectively his military methods could be adapted to entirely different geographical and cultural environments. The victories at Mohi and Legnica demonstrated that European heavy cavalry, despite their reputation for invincibility, were no match for the coordinated tactics and superior mobility of Mongol forces. The decision to withdraw from Europe after Ögedei's death in 1241 left Europeans wondering what might have happened if the Mongol invasion had continued. In China, the final conquest of the Jin dynasty in 1234 completed the work that Genghis Khan had begun decades earlier. The fall of the Jin marked the first time in more than a century that northern China had been unified under a single authority, demonstrating the effectiveness of the administrative systems that Genghis Khan had developed for governing sedentary populations. The subsequent Mongol campaigns against the Song dynasty would take another 4 decades to complete, but they would ultimately establish the Yuan dynasty as the first foreign power to rule all of China. The Mongol conquests in the Islamic world would prove to be among the most destructive of all their campaigns. The capture of Baghdad in 1258 and the execution of the last Abbasid caliph marked the end of the symbolic center of Islamic unity that had existed for more than 5 centuries. Yet even these devastating conquests would ultimately lead to cultural synthesis and renewal, as the Mongol rulers of Persia gradually converted to Islam and became patrons of Islamic art, literature, and learning. The fragmentation of the empire into separate khanates was perhaps inevitable given its vast size and the diversity of its populations, but it also reflected the success of Genghis Khan's decentralized approach to administration. Each of the successor states, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, developed its own distinct identity while maintaining elements of the Mongol legal and administrative tradition. The Yuan dynasty in China, established by Genghis Khan's grandson Kublai Khan, represented perhaps the most successful synthesis of Mongol and Chinese traditions. While maintaining their distinct identity as Mongols, the Yuan rulers adopted many Chinese governmental practices and became patrons of Chinese culture and learning. The dynasty's capital at Kambalik, known to Europeans as Cambaluc, became one of the world's greatest cities, attracting visitors from across the known world. The Ilkhanate in Persia followed a different path, with Mongol rulers gradually adopting Islamic faith and Persian cultural practices while maintaining their political authority. This cultural transformation led to a remarkable flowering of Persian art and literature, including the great epic poetry of Hafez and Rumi, whose works drew inspiration from both Islamic and Mongol traditions. The Golden Horde's dominance over the Russian principalities established patterns of political and cultural interaction that would influence the development of Russian civilization for centuries. The Mongol emphasis on centralized authority and efficient administration would eventually be adopted by the rising Moscow Principality, contributing to the emergence of the Russian Empire as a major European power. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia remained closest to traditional Mongol culture and values, serving as a repository of nomadic traditions and practices that might otherwise have been lost as other parts of the empire became increasingly sedentary. This preservation of nomadic culture would prove important in later centuries when new nomadic confederations would emerge to challenge the settled empires of their time. The cultural impact of the Mongol Empire extended far beyond its political boundaries and survived long after its fragmentation. The development of new artistic styles that combined elements from different traditions created aesthetic innovations that would influence art and architecture for centuries. The distinctive blue and white porcelain of the Yuan period, the intricate miniature paintings of Mongol Persia, and the architectural fusion visible in buildings from Central Asia all reflected this creative synthesis. The literary legacy of the empire was equally significant. The Secret History of the Mongols, composed shortly after Genghis Khan's death, provided not only a historical record of his life and conquests, but also a masterpiece of world literature that revealed the inner world of nomadic culture. The work's combination of mythic narrative and historical detail created a model for epic literature that would influence storytelling traditions across Eurasia. The scientific and technological exchanges facilitated by Mongol rule had profound long-term consequences for human development. The transmission of printing technology from China to the Islamic world and eventually to Europe accelerated the spread of knowledge and the development of literacy. The movement of astronomical observations and mathematical techniques between different scholarly traditions led to advances that would eventually contribute to the scientific revolution. Medical knowledge also benefited enormously from the cultural exchanges promoted by Mongol rule. Chinese acupuncture and herbal medicine were introduced to Central Asia and the Islamic world, while Islamic surgical techniques and Persian pharmacology were transmitted to China. These exchanges created new synthetic approaches to medicine that improved health outcomes across the empire. The agricultural innovations spread by Mongol trade networks had equally important consequences. New crops introduced from distant regions improved nutrition and food security in many areas, while new farming techniques increased agricultural productivity. The introduction of New World crops to Asia, facilitated by Mongol trade networks, would eventually support population growth that made possible the great civilizations of the early modern period. The monetary and commercial systems developed under Mongol rule established precedents for modern international finance. The use of paper money backed by government authority, the development of credit instruments that could be honored across vast distances, and the standardization of weights and measures all contributed to the growth of commercial networks that would eventually span the globe. The diplomatic innovations of the Mongol Empire also had lasting influence on international relations. The establishment of formal diplomatic protocols, the exchange of permanent ambassadors, and the negotiation of complex multilateral treaties all became standard features of the international system. The Mongol emphasis on diplomatic immunity and the protection of envoys helped establish principles that remain important in modern international law. The environmental consequences of Mongol rule were complex and varied across different regions and time periods. In some areas, the disruption caused by military campaigns led to temporary ecological damage and population decline. In others, the empire's promotion of trade and urbanization led to increased pressure on natural resources and environmental degradation. However, the Mongol tradition of pastoral nomadism also contributed to more sustainable land use practices in many regions. The empire's rulers generally understood the importance of maintaining ecological balance and avoiding overexploitation of natural resources. This understanding, derived from generations of experience managing grazing lands and livestock, sometimes led to more environmentally conscious policies than those pursued by purely agricultural societies. The demographic impact of Mongol rule included both destructive and constructive elements. While the initial conquests undoubtedly caused significant population losses in many regions, the long-term effects of Mongol rule often included population recovery and growth. The empire's promotion of trade, urbanization, and cultural exchange created conditions that supported demographic expansion in many areas. The genetic legacy of the Mongol Empire has been documented by modern science, which has found evidence of Mongol ancestry in populations across Eurasia. These genetic studies suggest that the movement of people associated with Mongol expansion had lasting effects on human population structure, creating links between distant populations that persist to the present day. The linguistic influence of the Mongol Empire was profound and enduring. Mongolian loanwords entered many languages across Eurasia, while the empire's administrative needs led to the development of new linguistic tools and the standardization of existing languages. The Mongolian script system, adapted for use with multiple languages, became a model for creating writing systems for previously unwritten languages. The legal legacy of the empire, embodied in the Yasa and in the various legal codes developed by successor states, contributed to the evolution of jurisprudence across Eurasia. The Mongol emphasis on legal uniformity and equal treatment under law provided a model that would influence legal development in many different cultural contexts. The architectural heritage of the empire reflected the synthesis of different building traditions that occurred under Mongol patronage. While the Mongols themselves had little monumental architectural tradition, they became patrons of construction projects that combined elements from Chinese, Islamic, and other traditions. The resulting architectural styles influenced building practices across the empire and beyond. The religious impact of Mongol rule was perhaps most significant in its promotion of religious tolerance and interfaith dialogue. The empire's policy of allowing different religious communities to coexist and interact created opportunities for theological exchange and mutual influence that would have been impossible under more restrictive regimes. This tradition of religious pluralism would eventually contribute to the development of more tolerant and inclusive approaches to religious diversity. The educational legacy of the empire included the establishment of new institutions of learning and the promotion of scholarly exchange between different traditions. The movement of scholars and texts across the empire's vast territories led to the development of new educational approaches and the advancement of knowledge in many fields. The philosophical impact of Mongol rule was equally significant, as the encounter between different intellectual traditions led to new approaches to understanding the world. The synthesis of Chinese, Islamic, and nomadic philosophical traditions created new ways of thinking about political authority, social organization, and the relationship between humans and nature. The technological legacy of the empire included not only the transmission of existing technologies, but also the development of new innovations that emerged from the interaction of different technical traditions. The combination of Chinese metallurgy with Islamic engineering, for example, led to advances in military technology that would influence warfare for centuries. The commercial legacy of the empire provided the foundation for the development of modern global trade networks, the techniques developed for managing long-distance commerce, the legal frameworks created for international trade, and the financial instruments designed for cross-cultural exchange all contributed to the emergence of the integrated world economy. As the centuries passed, the memory of Genghis Khan evolved and changed, taking on different meanings for different peoples and cultures. In Mongolia, he remained the founding father of the nation, a symbol of independence and cultural identity that helped the Mongol people maintain their distinctiveness through periods of foreign domination. In China, he became part of the pantheon of great rulers who had shaped Chinese history, while in the Islamic world, his conquests were gradually integrated into the broader narrative of Islamic civilization. European perceptions of Genghis Khan were shaped by limited and often distorted information, creating an image of the Mongol leader that emphasized his destructive aspects while ignoring his constructive achievements. This European mythology would persist for centuries, influencing Western understanding of Asian history and contributing to stereotypes about nomadic peoples that would affect international relations well into the modern period. Modern scholarship has worked to develop a more balanced and comprehensive understanding of Genghis Khan and his empire, recognizing both the destructive aspects of Mongol expansion and its positive contributions to world civilization. This more nuanced view sees the Mongol Empire as a crucial transitional period between the ancient and modern worlds, a time when the foundations of our current global civilization were being established. The archaeological investigation of Mongol sites has provided new insights into the material culture of the empire and the daily lives of its inhabitants. Excavations at Karakoram, the Mongol capital, and other important sites have revealed evidence of the cosmopolitan nature of Mongol society and the sophisticated administrative systems that governed the empire. The study of Mongol influence on world history has also been enhanced by advances in historical methodology and the availability of sources in multiple languages. Scholars working with Chinese, Persian, Arabic, and European sources have been able to construct more complete and accurate accounts of Mongol activities and their consequences. The ecological impact of the Mongol Empire has become a subject of particular interest as environmental concerns have grown in importance. Some researchers have suggested that the population losses caused by Mongol conquests may have contributed to reforestation and carbon sequestration that affected global climate patterns. While these theories remain controversial, they illustrate the far-reaching consequences of historical events. The study of the Mongol Empire has also contributed to our understanding of the dynamics of cultural contact and exchange. The empire provides one of the best historical examples of how different civilizations can interact and influence each other, offering insights that remain relevant for understanding contemporary issues of globalization and cultural diversity. The technological innovations associated with Mongol rule continue to influence modern developments. The empire's emphasis on communication and transportation networks, for example, provided models that have been adapted for modern systems of global communication and commerce. The Mongol approach to managing diversity and promoting cooperation between different groups offers lessons for contemporary efforts to build inclusive and tolerant societies. The military legacy of Genghis Khan remains relevant for modern strategic thinking. His emphasis on speed, flexibility, and coordination continues to influence military doctrine, while his understanding of the importance of intelligence and psychological warfare provides insights that remain valuable for contemporary military leaders. The political legacy of the empire, with its combination of centralized authority and decentralized administration, has influenced the development of modern federal systems and international organizations. The Mongol approach to governing diverse populations across vast territories offers lessons for contemporary efforts to build effective supranational institutions. In the end, the story of Genghis Khan transcends the boundaries of any single historical period or geographical region. His life and achievements represent one of the great turning points in human history, a moment when the isolated civilizations of Eurasia were brought into contact with each other in ways that would permanently alter the course of world development. The transformation of a tribal society into a world empire, accomplished within a single generation, demonstrated the potential for rapid and fundamental change that exists within human societies. The innovations in military organization, political administration, and cultural integration pioneered by Genghis Khan and his followers provided models that would be adapted and modified by countless later civilizations. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongol Empire showed that it was possible to create political systems that could successfully govern diverse populations across vast distances. While the empire ultimately fragmented, the techniques and institutions it developed for managing diversity and promoting cooperation provided valuable precedents for later efforts to build inclusive and effective forms of government. The vast steppes of Mongolia, where this extraordinary story began, continue to whisper in the wind of ancient glories and distant conquests. The felt tents may be fewer now, and the great herds smaller, but the memory of the universal ruler who once rode across these grasslands remains as eternal as the blue sky above. In the silence of the steppe night, when the stars shine down with the same cold brilliance they showed to Temujin so many centuries ago, one can almost hear the distant thunder of hoofbeats and the echo of a name that once struck fear and wonder into the hearts of nations. The modern world, with its global communications and international commerce, bears the imprint of innovations first developed under Mongol rule. The tolerance for diversity, the emphasis on merit over birth, and the understanding that different cultures can contribute to a common enterprise all reflect principles that Genghis Khan helped to establish. His vision of a unified world, while achieved only briefly and partially, continues to inspire efforts to build more integrated and peaceful international relations. The lessons of his life, the importance of adaptability, the value of learning from one's enemies, the necessity of building bridges between different communities, remain as relevant today as they were 8 centuries ago. In an age when the world faces challenges that require cooperation across cultural and national boundaries, the example of the Mongol Empire offers both inspiration and practical guidance for building more effective forms of global governance. The name of Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, whose story continues to unfold in the endless dance between memory and legend, between the dreams of empire and the reality of human ambition, echoes still across the centuries. The wind carries these whispers across the generations and across the world, reminding us that even in the most remote corners of the earth, greatness can be born, and that the actions of a single individual can ripple through time to touch the lives of countless millions yet unborn. In the vast tapestry of human history, few threads have been woven with such skill and such consequence as the life of the man who united the tribes of the steppes and taught the world new possibilities for human cooperation and achievement. His legacy endures not in stone monuments or written proclamations, but in the living institutions and continuing traditions that still shape our world today. A testament to the enduring power of vision, courage, and the unquenchable human drive to transcend the boundaries of what seems possible.